tests. Whatever makes you happy. Really dig into this. It is not just for making little blog demos. I would encourage you to check it out. So let's go ahead and run this. What would we call it? Blog? All sorts of things are going wrong today. Blogs. All right. So let's look at our SQL database. So it got created. Now, one way that we can visualize this is just kind of interesting, because you always see the entity framework guys dragging around tables and stuff, is remember that we wrote all this with code. So why don't we go and say, add new item, and remember that Visual Studio has this thing called the class diagram, how we let you visualize your code, not your database, it's your code. Let us pick up models and drag it in here. So here is the code first model, because it's just classes. It doesn't know anything about the database. Okay? Then what if I went into Server Explorer and brought up my database connection for my newly created database and made a database diagram that looked like what the database looks like. So let's see. Add new diagram. Add all these things. Arrange tables, maybe. Cool. So now I've got my database on the right using the diagramming stuff built into SQL tools. I've got my classes on the left, and you can see that tag and post are related with a table called tag post, because they had a many-to-many, remember that? Then we've got post and post photo automatically associated as well. So I found that to be a really, really helpful way for me to learn EF code first, was to have my classes on the left and a class diagram, my database on the right there. And then when you're doing development, you do have your database dropping all the time. You use that initializer that I showed, blog initializer. There's a number of different choices that you can use. This one here we're saying drop and recreate database if the model changes. And then you can go and write your own database initializer, or you'll see in the future that we'll have other initializers. So when you're doing development and you're rapidly evolving your database, you would probably just drop and seed and drop and seed and drop and seed. Then when you get it working, take the SQL file and then check that in and go from there. So that really helped me work with code first. Let's take a look at IIS Express. One of the things I haven't actually talked about too much is how IIS Express fits into all of this. If I right-click on this project here, and I say Use IIS Express, actually, let's even make a fresh one so we don't do anything too goofy. We'll make a fresh project real quick. Okay. And we'll make that new one there. And that's all those NuGet packages are getting added down there in the corner. Then we'll just give him a new proper person. Okay. And then we'll scaffold out an actual person controller. I need to compile that. Add controller, person controller, person context, add. Okay, so you've used to seeing Visual Studio Web Development Server. I think it used to be called Cassini. You guys familiar with that, right? That's the tiny web server that runs right there, this guy here, the bubble server. And it's got some limitations. It's irritating in a number of ways. Let me count the ways. Doesn't support SSL, won't run on port 80. It's hard to get WCF stuff working, doesn't do certificates. it sometimes just doesn't work the way you want. It doesn't support the system.web server stuff. You can't install your own HTTP modules and handlers unless you put them up in the ASP.NET pipeline. It doesn't feel like IIS because it's not IIS, right? So stop using it. Seriously, you don't ever have to use it again, I promise. You can do two things. You can either right-click and say Use IIS Express. Do you want to do this? Yes, I do. That's why I clicked on it. Or you can say Tools Options. I do a lot of customization. And then you can ask Damien where you click that checkbox. Projects and Solutions. I knew that. And then this area is intentionally I left blank. And then I like to install like applications like 5 gigs of apps from a CD and then run this app, takes 2 gigs of memory, and then go Tools Options and go boop. So all the rest is blank. Just imagine things are happening when you check that box. Okay. So I'm going to run that. And now this guy comes up, this little stack of servers. That's IIS Express. So we'll click on him. And then we can see the So Fresh and So Clean site name and the PID for that site name and the URL. IIS Express, I think it runs on XP and up, doesn't it? Just run XP. Is not running as a service. It's running as me. So it's fully IIS, except I'm not running Visual Studio as administrator. It'll work on XP and up, and it is IIS. And I'll keep saying that over and over like I'm like selling a sham wow. But wait, that's not all. IIS Express will also run on port 80. No, you're kidding. Hey, hang on, I'll show you. So application.config on your IIS installation is where, right? It's like deep in the bowels of the system somewhere. But IIS Express is running in a kind of user mode, right? So it's actually in my documents. So the config for your IIS Express is different from another person using your same machine. So I can go and edit application host config and things like that directly here. So what I wanted to try to do, and let's see if I can pull it off, is I want to run it as port 80 and allow it to be used outside my box so that people could actually talk to my machine. A lot of people want to do development like this, except their administrators in their IT department won't let them put IIS on their machine. Or if they go and they get Cassini working, they want someone, like a buddy or a tester, to talk to that machine from the outside. And it's not possible because Cassini won't listen to anything other than localhost. And then you'll go and you'll make hacks in your hosts file, and then but you still have to have that port. It feels gross, right? So let's try this. I got some snippets. One of the things that people need to remember is that in the old days, before HTTP.sys, and we still have this model in our heads, one port maps to one process, right? If you've got port 80, that port is going to be handled by such and such a process. And a request comes in on port 80, and the system says, who's registered for port 80? Oh, he's got it. Boom. And if you run an application that got to that port first, too late. Well, HTTP.sys now runs in the kernel, right? So HTTP.sys reserves all of that. It handles all that HTTP traffic. It's the thing listening on port 80. And it then hands it off to your process. So multiple processes can listen on one port. So I have a lot more control. But I have to reserve that port. So I'm going to blog about all of this stuff. But what we're going to do is I'm going to run one time as admin this command line. And I'm going to say with netsh, hey, I want to go and add an ACL. We all know what ACLs are, right? You know, access control lists. That says that everyone can access Hanselman W500 on port 80. So I'm setting that aside. Okay? And I think what I can do probably is do the same thing for, I'm not sure I need to do it for 4432 when I do this in a minute. May already be there. Okay, good. So now you can do this manually by going into the firewall and just adding a firewall exception for IIS Express. Or I can do it with a command line, just open that port. I actually, my buddy gave me this particular line. I did it just by clicking on firewall and said allow a program through the firewall. That IIS configuration, remember, is over here in my documents. So I can actually open that config file up. And my application, I think, was called Fresh and Clean. Right? Everything for a reason. Because MVC application 98 is just not as memorable. So I can see here that So Fresh and So Clean is listening on HTTP on that goofy port on localhost. So why don't I copy that, say port 80, and put in Hanselman W500. Cool? Shut that down. Fire them up again. Then I'll come in here, and I could set this in the project if I wanted to, and I'll just put in Hanselman W500. And now I'm serving my just now developed MVC application on port 80, and people could potentially talk to this machine within my local subnet. So now it starts getting interesting. But everyone's talking about how you need to have like your logons and stuff secured by SSL. Remember how Twitter just changed this and Facebook just changed this because you don't want to send your passwords across the wire like that? Well, there's a couple things that I could do. I could go into my action methods and I could say require HTTPS. So I could go into my code and say for the account controller that needs to be SSL. Or I could go into the web config, and there's the system.web stuff that we're familiar with, but because this is IIS, and all of IIS, it really is IIS 7.5, I have a system.web server section, which means I have modules and stuff, that more powerful things. Any really complicated or realistic application inevitably ends up with some modules or some complexity. And I'll just put in this rewrite rule. And this rewrite rule says if you're going to account/logon or account/register, we're going to force you to HTTPS. So I didn't even have to change my links because it's going to redirect me. So I click log on, but of course no one's listening on SSL because I don't have a cert or anything like that. So that's not going to happen for me. So what I can do, and this is where it gets crazy. I was thinking, like, should I try to type it? Spend like 8 hours memorizing this? So I spent 7 hours, realized I couldn't do it, and instead figured you would forgive me. There are multiple ways to make certs. You can use like make cert in different ways, but this is the one that was given. What's significant is this, the name of the machine. If you had a host file thing and you wanted to call it, template monster or whatever, you could do that too. Okay, so I just made that cert. Now I'm down here in my certificate store. Hit refresh. It's going to go off and check revocation on all these. This one here expired on 2036. You see this? 2036. I set that because I wanted to remember it. Okay? That cert now has a unique hash associated with it. So I'll double-click on it. I'll go and grab its thumbprint. This funky number here. This is the GUID of that thing. And then I'm supposed to then pass that into a command that's cert hash. So I got a couple things that I could do now. I need to remove the spaces. I could go and remove them like that, but that would not be elite at all. So of course I will run PowerShell for no reason at all. I will then paste it in. Then I will say -replace, but that would be lame. So then I will pipe it to out clipboard, because that's badass. And then I will paste it in here. And I will